the Me&my Health Up podcast. I'm your host, Anthony Hartcher, a clinical nutritionist and lifestyle medicine specialist. The purpose of this podcast is to enhance and enlighten your well-being. And today I'll be doing that just for you. And we're going to be talking about the misconceptions, the lies that are told to us through healthcare, through our professionals, through social media. There's a whole lot of misinformation that is coming through to us. And I've just become aware of this really personally myself after doing several degrees or 2 degrees in health, and then subsequently learning more about health through educators that don't have a motive other than to share their understanding of science around the health. And I've started to dig into it myself and really start to ask questions about what we're told. And this comes around like saturated fats are bad for us. We hear cholesterol is bad for us. We hear all these misconceptions around light and sunlight, and that we shouldn't get, we need to cover ourselves up and protect ourselves from the sun. We hear all these things around health, yet how do we know what's actually right for us? How do we know what's actually true for us? And think about water consumption. I've recently learnt that I was consuming way too much water, but I was focusing on the guidelines that have been shared with us. And I was looking at the guidelines and where they come from, what's the origination of the source and where's it coming from that we need to consume like 2 to 3 liters or 35 mils per kilogram of body weight, which I've been sharing on the podcast as well. And I've realized that there's no real strong basis for what they're telling us around the water consumption that we need, and that it does take into consideration a whole lot of assumptions around what we're eating, where we are situated in the world, and the climate that we're exposed to, the environment, the type of work we're doing. It doesn't take into consideration any of that. And so it really does come down to an individual level. And what I found is the more you dig into it, you actually understand, you realize, well, I've certainly realized that it's a whole lot of, really misinterpretations or strewed or exaggerated truths or half truths, to say the best, to say that, to give, I guess, the benefit of the doubt in terms of where it's coming from. But it's really misleading. And I found it certainly misleading from my point of view. And I share this because recently I've cut down the amount of calories I'm consuming. I've restricted, I've limited them, and it's not in relation to weight loss. It's really in relation to good health. So I'm not trying to lose weight and trying to achieve a particular body type image. Purely, I'm just looking at wanting to optimize my well-being. And I'm starting to understand that calorie restriction helps with our longevity. Calorie restriction helps with mitochondrial function. Calorie restriction helps with apoptosis, autophagy, these things that really help us stay youthful and optimal. And I've started to cut, I don't generally do extreme things. I generally take steps in order to achieve the health goals or health outcomes that I'm pursuing. But one of these goals that I'm looking at doing is this calorie restriction. And so I've gone from 3 meals a day to 2 meals a day. And I was recently sitting around with my family and I wasn't eating, they were eating. And I said, I've had my 2 meals, I'm not having a third. But I was, sitting around and watching them eat and joining in on the conversation. And they asked me about it. And I started to think myself, why do we need 3 meals a day? Where's the origin of 3 meals a day? Like, where does it come from? So then I started to look into it, started Googling, started looking as to what's the origin. And then I started to find that the Romans, way back many centuries ago, were having 1 meal a day, and that was lunch. They just had 1 meal a day, lunch. And this was pre the Industrial Revolution. And what I found that with the introduction of the Industrial Revolution, obviously food became more available. it was obviously less available, and we had to preserve food, and we had to, obviously in summer when it was more plentiful, we'd generally probably eat a little bit more in order to nourish us for the winter, for when the food was less plentiful, because we didn't have ways to store it or refrigerate it or preserve it. I mean, we certainly had those salting ways of preservation and those sort of things, but pickling and stuff like that that came about in terms of how to preserve food so that we could sustain ourselves during the winter months. However, with the Industrial Revolution, that drove, I guess, more abundance around food and it being more plentiful. And the other thing it drove is a change in behaviors. So people were going off to work early in the morning and they were just working really hard throughout the day and they didn't get breaks. Obviously, there was no trade unions back then. And so what they decided is, well, that lunchtime meal that it generally was had for workers was not going to happen in the Industrial Revolution, when they were just pushed to work as hard as they could in order to optimize productivity. And so what they did was introduce break fast, which was to break the fast and to actually have some food before they went off to work. So that would sustain them through the day because they weren't getting that lunchtime meal. And so this one meal, then it will sort of then change, from lunchtime to breakfast. And then they'd have a meal at the end of the day. And that became like 2 meals a day. And then obviously as we became more affluent and, I guess some governance came into protecting the workers around, giving them rights and whatnot, then, lunch came back. And so this sort of evolved into 3 meals a day, just through the course of us progressing through the Industrial Revolution. And back then, like during the Industrial Revolution, we were inventing machinery to help us, but we were still doing a lot of manual labor and still working manually a lot. So yes, we're consuming more calories back then as well. Obviously, with automation, calorie consumption, I guess, dwindled with the automation coming on, and we became more office bound in time. But we just took traditional practices with us. So from those 3 meals a day, we just continued 3 meals a day. And now we're living a very sedentary lifestyle with 3 meals a day. But then that's become 5 meals a day, if you think about it, because we're morning tea and afternoon tea. And I was looking up the origin of lunch in terms of how that came about and during the Industrial Revolution. And that came about, so they had breakfast, obviously, but lunch came about from those that were networking. So those probably the business owners that decided to network with other business owners, they would do that over lunch and they would eat something. So the breakfast came in, the lunch came back. And so that lunch became a networking in order to do more business, to network and meet other people and to discuss how to help each other's businesses. And so this networking lunch came into it. And then obviously getting home from a days of work, then the family gets together and forms dinner. And so 3 meals a day just sort of happens, and then we just continue it through continuing traditions. And so then I started looking at, where does these calories, so we talk about females needing sort of 1,500 to 1,800 calories a day and males needing 2,200 or 2,500, whatever it is. But these sort of numbers that come up, and like if you look at 1,500 calories a day, that's basically 3 meals a day. A typical meal is about 500 calories. And then if you're looking at 5 meals a day, that's where 2,500 comes from in terms of calories. But these are, created through equations that were done through some experimentation around different body types in terms of height and weight, and looked at resting metabolic rates at which the body was consuming energy. And this I need to get my head around a bit better as to how solid are these experiments as to our resting metabolic rate, our basic metabolic needs, because there's breatharians in the world that don't consume any food. And so that really throws these equations out the window, these old equations that we're still using today to work out our resting metabolic rate in terms of the amount of calories we need in order to sustain basic function. And then you start to question question this, okay, so calories, that's how we're measuring energy from food. So where does calories come from? Well, it's burning like a gram of food within a vessel that's enclosed, not an open system, and it's the amount of energy that that gram of food produces. And if you start questioning this, well, that's assuming some sort of efficiency of us utilizing that food, ultimately to 100, 100%. It's within a closed system. We aren't in a closed system. We're in an open system. And so you start to question the foundations of these experiments around, okay, yeah, that food contains that calories, but we don't actually assimilate those calories because we don't have that closed system, and we don't obviously energy losses in our system because we're an open system. And so you start to question these equations and these ways in which food is counted as, an energy, amount of energy within that food. And everyone has this different way of metabolizing and metabolizing at different rates depending on our age. And see, some of these equations did take into consideration age, but then what part of the population have they taken? Again, we're very, have a very diverse range of ethnicities and races throughout the world and living at different latitudes, so exposed to different sunlight and amounts of sunlight, because sunlight is a way in which we take in energy as well. And so, again, these equations don't take that into consideration because these breatharians don't actually eat food. So they have no food, 0 calories. And so what is it that we extract from food? It's the electrons. So the electrons is what we ultimately extract. And we've got other ways of extracting electrons. So we can get electrons through earthing, through having our bare feet, our palms of our feet, or palms of our hands and our soles of our feet on the earth. We can take in electrons through that medium. And we can take in, obviously, our electrons get excited from the sunlight. It excites our electrons. And we create what we call this fourth phase of water through our metabolism. So our mitochondria generates this easy water through metabolism, and that phase separates into electrons and hydrogens, electrons, protons, electrons, and that creates a battery within our cellular function. And so we can energize that battery through the sun. And so it's really interesting in terms of when you start to really delve into the science and start to question what we're told around how many calories we should be consuming per day. Is calories a good measure? Should we be looking at electron level? And so this has started, for me to ask questions. And then so I've cut back to 2 meals a day. So I've reduced my calorie consumption by at least 500 calories. I'm probably down to 1,000 calories a day. So that's down, when you get down to around 500 to 800 calories a day, they call that a very restrictive, low caloric intake. And that's sort of that getting down to that 5 and 2 diet, where you have 2 days of doing that caloric restriction of around 500 to 800 calories, depending on if you're male or female. And so I'm doing quite that. And I've been doing it for weeks now. And I'm not really noticing a huge difference in terms of, I've had periods of fatigue, but I've realized it's water. It hasn't been really calories. It's sort of a bit of a dehydration, because I've also cut my reduction or water consumption because I'm eating more fats and more protein. With more fats and protein, we produce more metabolic water. And so I need less exogenous sources of water to come into my body because I'm producing more metabolic water. And we do that through the electron transport chain, which I've shared on a previous episode around mitochondrial health. And I shared also a bit of that around the deuterium story. So I'm starting to piece together these stories, and I'm going to continue to provide insight around these stories about these misconceptions and lies. And so I've only just touched on this one around calories and how many calories we need a day, and how really what's the basis of it. I'm not finding a strong evidence-based basis behind it, other than more sort of some old traditions that we've carried forward. And so I'm still down to around 2 meals a day. Some days I have 3 meals. So I'm probably doing the 5 and 2 in reverse. So I'm having those 5 days of more caloric restriction. So I'm not advocating starving yourself. I'm more advocating good health. And so I've got nothing to do with body image here. It's more me experimenting with how can I optimize my health? How can I optimize my mitochondria? And I'm doing this through caloric restriction. And I'm just going with how I'm feeling. And so I'm actually finding that I'm less hungry, eating less. I'm less hungry, eating less, but I'm doing other things to complement that. So I'm not just staying indoors 100% of the time, because indoors and in front of screens, that plays around with our hormonal system, our infradian system that Nathan Siles shares in his episode about light. So we have a circadian, which is obviously the influence of the environment on our infradian system. Our infradian system is that system that runs based on the circadian. So the circadian feeds into the infradian system, and that is running our systems within us. But it's obviously tunes itself to the circadian rhythm. So when we talk circadian rhythms, it's the night-day cycle. Our infradian system is our hormonal, our reproductive system, all these systems that require sunlight, such as our immune system, our digestive system. All our systems require, even our nervous system requires getting in touch with what's happening externally. We need to be in touch with what's happening. We need to be coupled with the environment. And so it's this decoupling of the environment is when we get sick, is when our body has no idea whether it's night or day and what it should be doing, and it gets lost. And we get a miscommunication happens between our systems, and this miscommunication results in poor health, disease outcomes. So we certainly want to make sure we're staying in sync with the circadian rhythm. Hence why I've changed up my morning routine. I'm getting out in the morning to make sure I'm turning my infradian, my internal body clock, and syncing it. So we need to sync it with the circadian rhythm, which is the night-day cycle. And we can only do that through being outdoors. We can't do it being indoors. And so if I spend too much time indoors, I have a lot of miscommunication happening between my systems of my body. And that's when ill health or disease or lack of energy will set in, because the body's lost. It doesn't know what it should be doing at what time of the day. So we need to keep it in sync with the night-day cycle, the circadian rhythm. So I've just mentioned the whole energy thing and how I'm reducing my energy consumed via food. But what I'm doing is upping my energy from the environment, such as I'm doing more earthing. I'm connecting my feet, my soles of my feet to the earth, which whether it be grass or to the sand, and allowing electrons to come through the earth. The earth is negatively charged. The sun is positively charged, cathode, anode, and hence the transfer of energy between the sun and planet Earth. And so I'm taking in the electrons from planet Earth, and that's also fueling me. This is how the breatharians actually get by without consuming any foods, because they're living outdoors. Okay, they're breathing the fresh, good air. They're in sync with the circadian rhythm. Their infradian system's in sync, and they're getting by with just breathing. So it's incredible how we actually, and so the other thing that's going to interfere with our infradian system is these non-native EMFs. So not the EMFs, electromagnetic frequencies we pick up from the sun or the earth through magnetism. It's the electromagnetic frequencies that man have created or altered, such as the phone and the computers and all this technology that we're surrounded by, all these motors and all these non-native EMFs. And these non-native EMFs is what it sends, and it affects easy water production. It has a big bearing on easy water production. It has a bearing on the signaling between systems within our body. And we get this crossover or these mixed messages between the systems, and we lose our, synchronicity. And this synchronicity is what gives us good health, is when everything's working in harmonious together with the environment. And so it's important that we work with the environment, we stay in tune with the environment. We look to get other ways of bringing energy into our body that isn't eating food, such as magnetism through earthing on the ground, such as getting sunlight onto our skin through our eyes, really important. And the really helpful sun is, well, the full spectrum is helpful, but in terms of starting out, it's the infrared light, we get in the morning. So it's the warmth that you feel on your skin. So when you can feel that warmth on your skin, that's the infrared light. It's non-visible light. It's out of the visible spectrum. And so these are long wavelength light, and long wavelength light penetrates deep into our body, deep into the brain. And it really helps with mitochondrial function, which is the powerhouse. It runs our brain, it runs our heart. And when we've got dysfunctional mitochondria, that's when we get heart disease. That's when we get brain disease, such as Alzheimer's. This brain degeneration happens when we're not looking after our mitochondria. And to look after our mitochondria, we really want to get that infrared light, which is strong throughout the day. It's always available within the light spectrum, but it's coupled with UV in the middle of the day. And we don't need a lot of UV. Excess UV is damaging to us, but we do need a bit to create vitamin D. And so this is the thing. We tell people not to get out in the midday sun, but we do need some exposure during the midday sun, or during that sort of 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. where UVB is present, because UVB helps the body synthesize vitamin D. And vitamin D is essential for transmitting light within our body. It's really essential for that, same as melanin. Melanin is what we produce and send to the skin to take in the full spectrum of light. And then it then goes within our body and translate that light signals from the outside on into the inside, and lets our body know what time of the day it is. So we need melanin, which obviously we produce more of it the more exposed we are to sun, but we want to start gentle exposure to sun. So melanin is that gives us the coloring of our skin. So it makes our skin a bit darker. And again, we need to tailor this to the individual, because some people that are really white don't need as much sun exposure compared to those that are very dark. Those that are very dark need more sun exposure. So it really depends on which latitude you sit on in the world in order to work out how much sun exposure you need. And obviously, if you're hereditary, or you're hereditary, where you come from, your origins, depending, if you're in those real higher latitudes of the world, such as in the poles, then those latitudes, such as Iceland and the Nordics and things like that, they actually exposed to less sun than the equator. So if you're living around the equator, then you're exposed to a lot more sun, and it's consistent throughout the year. So it's 12 hours throughout the year, 12 hours. And so the equator is got more sun exposure, and their skin can tolerate more sun exposure. But it's really important for those around the equator, don't take the Western world advice in terms of getting out of the sun. It's dangerous. Yes, it's dangerous when you do anything to excess. And I was doing water consumption to excess. I realized recently, and I'll jump onto the water thing and get back to the light and the latitudes. But in terms of water consumption, what I realized was I was consuming too much. I was following the guidelines, drinking 2 to 3 liters a day exogenously, and not realizing that I create metabolic water, and not realizing that I'm actually putting a load on my heart, because I'm creating more volume within my body, within the blood, and the heart has to work hard to move that volume around. And so what I realized is that I was getting not so great circulation to my extremities, because they were getting cold. But it was because I was overloading myself with water. The heart was working hard. So I was elevating my blood pressure. So I was doing my heart disservice. Elevated blood pressure, not good for longevity, not good for, high blood pressure for long periods of time, because this is what creates problems within the body. It's not the high cholesterol, we've realized through the research. So there's actually studies that show that high cholesterol is associated with longevity, but it's high cholesterol coupled with a low inflammatory lifestyle, or a managed inflammation lifestyle. So we need inflammation. Inflammation serves us, but it's not prolonged inflammation. It's adaptable inflammation, where we've got a nice balance or harmony between inflammatory and anti-inflammatory. We need both. They come together. But what we don't want is one that's predominant over the other. And so what I was experiencing was lots of water, blood, high blood pressure, lows, poor circulation to the extremities, and I was getting candida in the toes. And so I was working out, why? And that is the way in which nature helps me. It helps trim down my toes and gets rid of because I'm not getting the nutrients to my toes. So nature comes in the form of fungi and helps break it down, because I'm not doing that recycling down there, because I'm not getting the blood flow down there in order to do the recycling and get out the toxins and the waste products. And so the fungi comes in and helps out. So nature does its work, but I wanted to get the fungi out of my toes. I wanted to do it. I didn't want the fungi doing that job. And so what I've done, and it'll be interesting over time, I can already start seeing an improvement in my toes. And so it wasn't that, because I was doing lots of tests around, you must have excessive candida in your system. And I didn't. My gut health. So I did a gut stool analysis. I had right amounts or normal amounts of candida. I didn't have excessive amounts of candida. I didn't have any of these other symptoms that, I wasn't getting thrush or anything like, or, getting the white tongue or anything like that with excessive amounts of candida. And I was thinking, I don't consume excessive amounts of sugar. So why have I got candida in my toes? And what I've worked out is a circulatory problem, because I was also getting cold hands and feet. And it's because I was consuming too much water. It's obvious to me now, because I've cut back on the water consumption. My blood pressure's come down significantly. It's well within normal ranges now. It was elevated before, and I was thinking, I'm not really stressed. I do have a good handle on my emotions. I'm constantly balancing my perceptions. So why do I have elevated? Because I was consuming, just chugging down water. And so I've actually halved my water consumption, halved it. And I was thinking, okay, if I halve my water consumption, I'm going to start to have problems. I'm going to start to get headaches. I'm going to start to feel delirious. I'm going to start to feel fainting. I'm going to start to get constipated because I haven't got enough lubrication going through my bowels. And what I found is actually my stools got better. So my stools are perfect, tight 4 stools. So I'm really loving that. Great stools. I'm drinking less water, which is good, because I'm, not loading so much volume into obviously my arteries, and the heart's not having to pump around so excessive amounts of volume. And so the heart's not working as hard. My heart rate has dropped, blood pressure's dropped. So my resting heart rate's dropped well below 50 now. It's dropped at least 10%. My blood pressure would have dropped at least 10 to 15%. So I'm starting to get this better picture around cardiovascular health simply through reducing water consumption. And on top of that, I've increased saturated fats. And I've actually also looked at my cholesterol. And surprisingly, because I'm getting more sun exposure, my cholesterol is, well within normal range. It's actually better than what it's ever been. So I used to always get told I had elevated cholesterol. I've been getting more sun exposure. So I've been converting my cholesterol to vitamin D. I've been synthesizing it like the sun does. And so I've increased my sun exposure gently. I've reduced my caloric restriction. I've reduced that slowly. I haven't gone from 3 meals a day down to 1 meal a day, because I've had, hosts, I guess, I've read David Sinclair's book on longevity, and he has 1 meal a day, and he advocates 1 meal a day. I haven't gone from 3 meals to 1 meal a day. I've simply just gone from 3 to 2 meals a day. I'm just slowly stepping it down, because the other thing I've got to take into consideration is I'm a very active person. I love activity. And so on a given day, I can consume up to 3,000 calories. Whether that's a good measure or not, as I mentioned before, I'm not sure. But anyway, so in the caloric measures, so if I'm eating 1,000 calories a day and I'm consuming 3,000, but I still got good energy, okay, I must be getting energy through other sources. It's not just about calories. Now we need to talk about electrons. So how are you consuming your electrons? How are you looking after the communication within your body so that you've got maximum energy? And so my episode on mitochondria is something you might want to check out in terms of how you want to optimize your mitochondria. I'm actually doing a renovation of my mitochondria. And I talk about that in the mitochondria episode, which is prior to this one. So certainly check out the mitochondria episode, because I talk about what I'm doing in relation to maximizing, optimizing it. But part of it is calorie restriction, because caloric restriction, you think about it in terms of helping the body. If you've got too much electrons coming through from food, it's just overwhelmed. So that, again, when we have too much of anything, systems get overwhelmed. We get overwhelmed. Like, so when your inbox gets really, really full up, it creates a stress response. You start getting stressed, you feel overwhelmed, and you start to become inefficient in terms of getting through that because of the overwhelm in your, and you think, where do I start? Oh, I'll start on this. Oh no, I should get around to that. Oh, this person's calling me to do that. And so you start jumping around to various jobs, tasks and whatnot, and you become quite inefficient because of the overwhelm. And it's the same as our energy system, our mitochondria. If it's overwhelmed with all this calories from carbohydrates, and the thing about carbohydrates, which I realized, though I've actually had to correct myself. So on previous episodes, I was sort of saying, about carbohydrates, that it's not all bad. Well, it isn't all bad around carbohydrates. And certainly what I've realized through digging deeper into the research is that kids certainly need more carbohydrate types of fuel than adults. And I mentioned this in the deuterium episode, so you might want to go and listen to that, just recorded prior to this one. Is carbohydrates contain a lot of deuterium. And when I'm talking about overwhelming our metabolic function or our system in terms of the mitochondria actually has to process a lot more of the carbohydrates because it contains a lot more water within it. And that water can contain an isotope of hydrogen, which is deuterium, and it's twice as heavy as protium. Protium is your, I guess, normal or light water or light hydrogen, whereas deuterium contains a neutron in the nucleus in addition to the proton, and that makes it twice as heavy, twice as big. And what that does is create more work in terms of the Krebs cycle, and the Krebs cycle becomes quite inefficient because of it having to get rid of the deuterium hydrogen and replace it with protium. And it gets quite inefficient at doing that. And as a result of that, it gets quite leaky, and electrons are leaked in this process. And these electrons combine with oxygen and create these free radicals, these ROS, these, reactive oxygen species within our system. And again, that's not all bad. It's just if we're creating too much of it. Again, it's a signaling molecule. So we tend to demonize reactive oxygen species, ROS, but it's actually a signaling molecule to the mitochondria in terms of whether it's inefficient or efficient. And so there is a feedback mechanism in relation to ROS, but if we're producing too much of it, the body then says, oh, this mitochondria is out of control and becoming very inefficient and creating too much free radicals. We need to get rid of it. And so it then requires, then you're starting to get rid of mitochondria. And again, that's okay. But if we're getting rid of a lot of mitochondria because we're feeding it too much in terms of carbohydrates are rich in deuterium, it gets overwhelmed and very inefficient. We start losing mitochondria and our body just becomes inefficient in terms of its processing of this deuterium and trying to get it out so that it can create energy. So what I've gone to is foods, and this ties back into the water. I mentioned that metabolic water and how I can consume less exogenous sources, such as drinking water, because I'm producing more metabolic water. And this is coming through fats, and fats are low in deuterium. So I'm increasing more fats. And then this links back, I guess, health talk around saturated fats are bad for us. Minimize saturated fats. Saturated fats aren't bad for us. Again, it depends on how that saturated fat is prepared, that whether it's bad for us. So if that saturated fat is heated to buggery, is really again, it's more the unsaturated fats that oxidize easier, and so that they get more toxic quicker. And so it's the seed oils really But the saturated fats, again, if heated, they are a bit more stable with heat, but they do become unstable. And this is the problem. When we start to alter the way in which these foods are naturally produced, the more altering, the more processing, the more harm we're introducing into our body. And again, it's just the excessive consumption. So just getting back to, I'm consuming more saturated fats now. And this went against I had an episode on cholesterol. You've probably listened to my cholesterol episode where I'm saying it's, not necessarily the cholesterol in the foods that it's not great for us. It's consuming too many saturated fats. Well, I've got to reverse what I've just said there, because I've actually learned it's not entirely true what I was sharing. I was sharing that from the literature. So I was getting that from clinical studies. But I've realized that all clinical studies have also the nuances around, they're not the full picture either. And they're not the full story either, because of the environments which they're done in and the people they've done it with, and whether they're done in laboratories with and whether they're actually done with people or with mice. So mice are nocturnal, for example. We're not nocturnal. We're diurnal. So again, you've got to start to question any of these studies that are done on mice, because they're not the same as us. They're nocturnal animals. They pick up different light signals from the environment. They're looking, and they're doing different things at different times of the day based on that light signal. So again, I don't like some of these clinical studies that, again, are referring to my studies, because it's not reflective of what's going on with us. And again, what population was chosen and whether that's relative to you. Does that apply to you? Because again, we all come from different parts of the world in terms of our origins, and we have a different genome, genetic pool. And so we need to work with that. And some of these studies are done on, just talk about these randomized clinical trials, but how random are they? And how much influence have they had from the person that's funding them? That's the other question. Is these clinical trials are all funded and the funder has an invested interest. Okay, that person that's funding the clinical trials has an invested interest in the outcome of the clinical trial. And that can influence what's published and what's not published, because what we only see is what's published. And that obviously supports their hypothesis. They don't publish anything that's not, they've done a clinical trial in that disproves their hypothesis. They're obviously wanting some commercial outcome. They're wanting to get a return on investment on their research. And so you've got to start to question where you get this information. I've started to do that, and I've realized I need to be more mindful as to where my sources are coming from and the credibility of those sources. So I'm starting to get my source information from decentralized medical professionals. So these are people that are smart, they've got medical degrees, but they're not run by centralized medicine. They're not told what to say, what to do. They are actually working with the science, working with nature. So it's really important that we question the sources. And so I have no doubt that you're probably questioning all what I've shared on this podcast with you. And yes, I've got some of my sources from decentralized sources and some from centralized sources. So the ones that have come from my professional background come from centralized sources, because these are government regulated degrees that I got. And so the government determines what goes into those degrees and what doesn't. And there's so many influences on the government in terms of political influences on the government, which then drive what goes into the education. But I now realize that I need to start getting it from decentralized sources, which most of probably the last at least 12 months, I think, are coming more from decentralized sources. So in terms of decentralized sources, the work that I've done with Dr. Demartini is decentralized source of information. He's a polymath. Dr. Jack Cruz is where I'm getting a lot of this information from. He's a polymath and he's a decentralized medicine practitioner. And I'm starting to get it from various sources like these, that I'm starting to then dig into the literature where they're getting it from, and starting to, see that, what they're saying is absolutely aligns up from a physics point of view, a chemistry point of view, a biology point of view, and it makes sense. And there's plenty of evidence pointing in that direction. This episode has been me wanting to share how important it is around misconceptions and lies. And let me get back to the saturated fats, because I got on a bit of a tangent there. So with the saturated fats, they've got more hydrogen, hence more electrons coupled with the hydrogens. And so they're greater energy source, and that's reflected in calorific value because they're a longer molecule. So obviously they're going to contain more energy because they're a longer molecule. But they also, obviously, fat and water don't mix, and so they come deuterium just about depleted, right? So they're really low in deuterium, and it's a lot easier for our mitochondria to work with, and our mitochondria can get more efficient with working with fats. And this is why I love saturated fats, is because they are more stable. Whereas the unsaturated fats, yes, we do need unsaturated fats, but again, we don't want to be consuming too much of anything, because if we're altering the state of these unsaturated fats, these polyunsaturated fats, such as we're heating them, and you probably remember, I've done some with podcasts with Udo Erasmus on fats and using fats as your primary fuel source, and he talks about how we changing the state of those fats, and we are actually glycating them through heating them and creating these AGEs, which is advanced glycation end products, right? And these in excess, again, are toxic. They're creating these free radical species within us. And so it does create inflammation when that builds up. And so when we're heating our oils, particularly the unsaturated, the polyunsaturated fats, such as the avocado oil, such as like any other linseed oil or anything like that, these are, what we typically say are good seed oils or oils. I mean, I guess the olive oil is a fruit, but then it's not heating it. So I've now gone to not frying with foods because of what we're doing in terms of creating these unstable products, which are unstable within our body and create these free radicals, which are damaging in excess. So I'm eating more saturated fats, but they're coming from like avocado, for example. That's a good unsaturated fat. Cheese, really hard cheeses, I'm eating more of because that's a good saturated fat that is low in deuterium. So I'm eating more of these fat sources. Again, fats on meats, which I thought were not great for us because they're saturated fats. And I've been telling people not to do that. But I've missed the big picture. And again, we've got to put this into context. So if we're talking saturated fats, they got to come from grass-fed sources. Because if they're grain fed, then they're not as healthy. And again, grains contain deuterium, okay? And we'll store deuterium in our fats when we can't deal with it because it's like a heavy metal in our body. We need to get rid of it. We need to put it away into stores. And so we don't want to be eating grain fed animals because it defeats the purpose of eating the saturated fats. So it's really important to eat grass fed saturated fats. And that's when you can have like the grass-fed beef, for example, the grass-fed Wagyu beef. That is good, but provided you're doing other things that are supporting your mitochondria. And that requires, we need to be active. We need to drive at activity. We need to get sweaty in order to help detoxification, get rid of excessive deuterium that we take in from when we consume water, for example, and when we eat fruits high in deuterium. Again, I talk a lot about this in my deuterium exercise, in my deuterium podcast, which has been released prior to this one. So what I really want to bring this together with is saying that I'm making all these changes to improve my health, but you need to put it into context. Yes, I'm eating more saturated fats. Saturated fats are helping me create more metabolic water. So by having more hydrogens within the saturated fat molecule, I can create more easy water, fourth phase metabolic water. And so therefore I can get away with drinking less water. But again, it's really important that you do this at your pace. And if you need help, please reach out to me. I'm happy to guide you with this because I've got experience working with this. I understand the science behind it, and I understand how to do it holistically, because it's so important that you do this holistically. Because if you're not doing all the things that I'm suggesting together, such as getting light, along with having the saturated fats, along with being active, along with doing a bit of cold and hot exposure, doing all these things together, then and then also, like I haven't mentioned, but I did mention on the deuterium in the deuterium one, is that we need to remove other deuterium sources, such as fruits are high in deuterium, starchy vegetables are high in deuterium, because that's where the plant puts the deuterium away. It's where it stores it. And so, and again, put this in the context, is that this is okay with, deuterium's okay with kids because deuterium is associated with growth and structure. Kids are growing, adults aren't growing anymore, and our structure is pretty much developed. And so, and again, the other thing I've learned is how this ties into collagen. Like, people just grab one aspect of health and then say, okay, yes, we put, in order to keep good, healthy, healthy skin, we need to have, create healthy amounts of collagen. And so, yes, we can produce collagen through consuming the essential amino acids. Again, excessive collagen is going to come with deuterium. So again, we don't want to do that in excess either. And so we really need to get back to this, getting everything into a holistic picture and then pulling everything together so that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts and not just focusing on one aspect. And so this is probably why I'm leading you to either reach out to me and get some guidance. I've created a program around this. My holistic mind mastery program incorporates all of what I've shared, and it's all based on decentralized sources of information that haven't got the regulation, that have motives or have bias and all that sort of stuff. These are more just pure science based, without the hidden agendas, without the political agendas. And so I've crafted a holistic mind mastery program, which I've been doing. I've noticed significant improvements in terms of my mental health, my energy, all my biomarkers, which I can share with you, have significantly improved. This holistic mind mastery program comes with you doing the test beforehand, before and afters, and I'm guiding you. So I'm coaching you, and we're doing one-on-one coaching as well as group coaching throughout the program to ensure you get personalized support that takes in consideration your origins, your genotype, and in terms of, getting that healthy amount of sun exposure, doing that successfully without overdoing the UV exposure, but getting enough to synthesize vitamin D, getting enough to helping you better manage your cholesterol. And so it's doing it all together in a holistic way that really brings the benefit. You can't just take one aspect of this and again, you can focus on one aspect, but then bringing in other aspects over time, that works. But just taking one aspect and thinking I've got health and this is what health is all about, it's not all about that. It's about everything I've just mentioned and about doing it in a way that works for you. And this is where it's really important to tailor health to you because you're completely unique and individual. And so that is really what I wanted to share today. I know I've shared a lot of information, but I really, suggest if you want to go on this journey, join me on the Holistic Mind Mastery Program, and the link will be in the show notes. So go to the link, find out more, reach out if you've got any questions, and let's 2024 be a journey of decentralized medicine and really optimizing your health and well-being and minimizing the amount of misconceptions and the ill truths that are out there so that you can do the right things for you. Thank you for listening. Please share it with others that you believe that could benefit from this episode. And I wish you the best in all 2024, and please give me feedback. Thank you.
Podcast disclaimer. This podcast and any information, advice, opinions, or statements within it do not constitute medical, healthcare, or professional advice and are provided for general information purposes only. All care is taken in the preparation of the information in this podcast. Connected Wellness Proprietary Limited, operating under the brand me&my Health Up, does not make any representations or give any warranties about its accuracy, reliability, completeness, or suitability for any particular purpose. This podcast and any information, advice, opinions, or statements within it are not to be used as a substitute for professional, medical, psychological, psychiatric, or any other mental health care or healthcare in general. me&my Health Up recommends you seek the advice of a doctor or qualified health provider with any questions you may have regarding a medical condition. Inform your doctor of any changes that you may to your lifestyle and discuss these with your doctor. Do not disregard medical advice or delay visiting a medical professional because of something you hear in this podcast. This podcast has been carefully prepared on the basis of current information. Changes in circumstances after publication may affect the accuracy of this information. To the maximum extent permitted by the law, me&my Health Up disclaims any such representations or warranties to the completeness, accuracy, merchantability, or fitness for purpose of this podcast, and will not be liable for any expenses, losses, damages incurred, indirect or consequential damages or costs that may be incurred as a result of the information being inaccurate or incomplete in any way and for any reason. No part of this podcast can be reproduced, redistributed, published, copied, or duplicated in a form without prior permission of Me and My Health Up.